Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Husey, and I'm Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies as part of the Air Force Association. Thank you for watching this on-demand presentation, which is part of our virtual Nuclear Deterrent and Triad Symposium entitled Second to None, Working Together to Modernize America's Nuclear Deterrent. I'm happy to be co-hosting this event with the great people from the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute in Louisiana. Originally, we planned a live conference there, but because of the COVID-19, we have decided to go virtual. We're very fortunate today to have a colleague and friend, Mr. Henry Sokolski. He's Executive Director of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center, which works to provide decision makers with a better understanding of strategic weapons proliferation issues. He's also a senior fellow for nuclear security studies at the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. He previously served as deputy for nonproliferation policy at the Office of Secretary of Defense, worked with the Office of Net Assessment on strategic weapons proliferation, served on 2 congressional commissions for the prevention of WAMD proliferation, and at one time was a Senate staffer. Henry, thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start today's session by giving you an opportunity to make a few opening remarks on the history of nuclear proliferation, the likelihood of further nuclear proliferation, and what can be done about it. So with that, sir, I'm going to turn this over to you. I want to thank you and your staff for helping us today and joining us.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me in your effort here today. The presentation I'm going to give was one that was first developed for the Strategic Deterrent Coalition, and I've tuned it since then. But they were concerned about what the future of nuclear deterrence might be if nuclear weapons spread, and I thought it was a pretty thoughtful question, and one that I certainly had not entirely prepared myself to present on, but now I'm ready. So you get the benefits of someone asking a good question, and I hope it's a question that interests you. It should, because essentially what this presentation is going to suggest is that with enough proliferation, you're going to have a very hard time using anything much to reduce the threat of any other country posing nuclear weapons or strategic weapons against you. So why don't we proceed to the first question set. 3 questions for today's presentation. First, does nuclear proliferation weaken deterrence? I'm going to argue the short answer is yes, and I'll give you a longer answer as to why momentarily. How likely is more nuclear proliferation? Short answer here again, I think plenty likely. What can be done? This is, I think, the good news. A lot. Now, sort of the dark side of the upside is I don't think it'll be very easy to do the things I'm suggesting, but we should at least try more than we are. So with that as the sort of gentleman's C presentation of what you need to know, why don't we get to the upperclassman's presentation? Okay. Now, the conventional wisdom on deterrence is so far so good. And I think this cartoon presentation, which I drew from the internet, is pretty good. I always crack a smile whenever I see this. If everyone has a gun and they're pointed at each other's backs, everyone should be on good behavior. Kind of like a conceal and carry law. I have a class I teach. If anyone lets me know that they're carrying a gun into the class, they get an automatic C, you know, or I guess now with great inflation, maybe it would be an A minus. but the point here is that shouldn't this work? And I think, you know, so far so good it has. The question you got to ask though is, you know, what happens if one of these folks, you know, gets bored and you know, really bored, and you know, we see this occasionally on a small scale. People go into movie theaters with an automatic weapon and they start shooting, and people die. So you're counting on no one getting that bored with nuclear weapons or anybody slipping, because maybe the safety isn't on, and you know, something bad could happen, and God knows what the others will do. I would argue that while we've done quite well, the idea that that can go on ad nauseum forever might be a bet against the house. If you go down to Las Vegas, you know what that means, is that the odds may not be with you, certainly if there are a lot of people in that circle. Now, I suppose the good news is if you get a large gun, you might be able to convince some of the other folks with guns to put theirs down and get behind your gun. But again, it's a little complicated. Let's go to the next slide. Now, one way to look at how well things are going is how well they've gone. You know, from 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only country that had nuclear weapons. And arguably, our economy was, as our president would say, huge compared to anyone else's. It was a kind of unipolar moment. And it was pretty stable. But, you know, for all of that, China fell, Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia fell. And although it was pretty stable, it wasn't as though having nuclear weapons alone was sufficient to get everything you wanted, but pretty stable. Let's go to the next slide. Well, of course, the Soviets got the bomb in 49. From 50 to 52, it was just the United States and Russia. And as I said, you know, we really had the beginning of the Cold War during this period, in earnest, very much earnest. This is the heyday of McCarthy, but more important, it was a period in which the United States was building, just as Russia was, as many nuclear weapons as they could, as quickly as they could. And it was feared that, you know, within a few years, by 1954, according to the people who wrote national security memoranda for the president, the Russians would have enough weapons to wipe out America's nuclear and military industrial base, which was 100 of the largest cities. And when that happened, at any moment, Russia could attack, and that would be it, curtains. So bipolarity, you know, wasn't quite as stable or calming as we kind of imagine, if we are to believe the people in charge of American foreign policy writing memoranda to the president. It wasn't just NSC 68. There were a number of other reports to the presidents that said, we only have a few years and then there'll be total war. Next slide. Well, luckily that didn't turn out to be the case, although we had a lot of near history during this period, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, which truly is a what if kind of history. We came awfully close, as best we can tell now. But there were other crises, Taiwan, crises over Berlin, even crises over Lebanon. In any case, there were additional uncertainties introduced by the French and the UK. Now, we tend to think of these countries as being allies and helpful friends. But when they got their nuclear weapons, actually it created a lot of tension with our alliance, and France kind of no longer was an active member of the nuclear planning effort, and was not really that much into NATO as it was before. The UK, meanwhile, had various issues up until the late 50s with the United States, even after it got nuclear weapons. More important, things began to get a little more complicated, but there you have it. You know, we managed through it. Again, there were some rather sporty moments of threatening to use weapons on the Russian and the US side. Next. Well, this is sort of where things roughly stand, even today. Now, even before North Korea entered the picture, you'll notice they're not on there. I guess initially, when I did this view graph so many years ago, and it was quite a while ago, the argument was that every time North Korea set off a weapon, it eliminated its stockpile, which roughly was the case with France in 1960. I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, people now are arguing the range might be, you know, several tens to several scores of nuclear weapons that North Korea has. But even before then, the way we looked at the world, and this was a chart that was developed for state policy planning, where they thought, well, really all that matters is the United States because it's the only country that can invade places like Iraq or Afghanistan and get its way. Everybody else basically defers to us. And so we suppose that China was a stakeholder, that Russia was a strategic partner, and everyone else was a NATO ally or a non-NATO ally, which meant we treated them as if they were a NATO member. This is sort of the high water of optimism. And the thought was, well, you know, we can live with this. And if anything, you know, perhaps if we can just keep this at this number, we're fine. However, you know, during this period, it wasn't really the case that countries didn't try to get nuclear weapons, and it wasn't even the case from 1963 to 2005 that nuclear threats weren't made. But this is the high water. And you could say, well, perhaps more is better then. Let's go to the next slide. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Did this, I think, about 20 years ago. You know, some of the names maybe would be different, but pretty good. You know, the argument here is, well, with enough countries that have nuclear weapons, or more likely could get them, you know, within 1 to 3 years, there are a lot of uncertainties. I showed this to some of my most hawkish brethren, and I have, since I'm sort of hawkish, a lot of those friends. The takeaway always was, oh, well, that just means we have to arm ourselves more. As long as we arm more, we'll be fine. I don't think that's quite the takeaway. I mean, the view one might have if you read history might be that at a certain point, there are only so many things even very clever people can keep count on. And that this view graph is an argument for humility, if not Christianity, and perhaps fear and loathing, that you probably can't cope with all the possibilities. And that even diplomacy, it won't work all that well at this point. Now, you could say, well, that's a theory, and you know, that's just a graph, and hey, it didn't happen, so you know, what's the issue? I mean, this seems like an academic political science point. Well, maybe, but I like to think there are other hard-headed people that sort of share my faith in the Church of Doom and Gloom. Let's take a look at the next slide. Well, here's one, Henry Kissinger, and you know. He's certainly a seasoned operator on the Washington scene, not a marshmallow. He wrote something which is worth repeating, which I think is worth considering. if one imagines a world of tens of nations with nuclear weapons and major powers trying to balance their own deterrent equations, that would be us, plus the deterrent equations of the subsystems, that would be them, deterrence calculations would become impossibly complicated. And this is in red. To assume that in such a world, nuclear catastrophe could be avoided would be unrealistic. Now, this is a matter of faith. You can buy into this or not. But the fact of the matter is, he may be right. And I don't think a lot of our planning, diplomatic or from a security standpoint, takes this point seriously at all. I think the sort of hard-headed culture, which would be, I guess, most of us, would say, well, nuclear proliferation is a fait accompli. They just need to arm up, that's all. And the others would say, well, maybe if we all hold hands, perhaps drink heavily, we can agree that this is a terrible thing and it won't happen. I don't know that either of those approaches is very serious. Certainly Mr. Kissinger, the people I studied under, Roberta and Albert Wohlstetter, people like Herman Kahn, people like Richard Brody, my former employers, Harry Rowan, Andy Marshall, they actually thought that you needed to deter other countries that had nuclear weapons and prevent your friends from getting them so that you could have an effective alliance to deter your adversaries. Those people are largely dead, but it doesn't mean they're wrong. Let's go to the next slide. How more likely is it? Well, more likely. First of all, what's different now from any decade previous is how available design information is. This design was the Iraqi design. It was inadvertently posted with much more detail on the IAEA website for about 6 months. And they learned that, well, wait a minute, they didn't know it was up so much, and they took it down finally when they were told it was too detailed, shouldn't have been up. This design was itself more advanced than the design we used at 1945 with our Mark III. And in fact, it would have worked and was shopped around a bit. Let's go to the next slide. Certainly Iran's design suggests, even in schematic, that it's not a Mark III, but more advanced. It looks like it's got at least a levitated pit. It could be hollow core for all we know. And certainly the bridge wire system and ignition system is far more advanced than anything first generation. That's because a lot of information was shared, some of it inadvertently. There's a book that caused a lot of classification kerfuffle that suggested that we had helped the Iran bomb design by not inadvertently, trying to fool them into trying to build a defective design. There's only one problem. The agent who was Russian who delivered the design admitted that it was defective and helped them figure out in what way. So let's go to the next slide. Well, here's the Swedes. In 1956, they figured out levitated pit, hollow core, 2-point ellipsoid ignition. This is pretty sporty. I mean, and that was in 56. So you got to assume that people are pretty smart. And if people could have figured that out, nearly 65 years ago, well, maybe somebody else has figured it out. Next design. Well, you have this picture. What if that really is a two-stage thermonuclear weapon? At the minimum, could North Koreans be willing to trade in thermonuclear technology? They certainly were willing to trade in the design of a production reactor with Syria. The short answer is probably. Well, where does that lead? I don't know. Heads up. Okay, next. Okay, now the other thing that's different from previous decades is that countries' leaders are explicitly and publicly saying they're willing to get nuclear weapons, even when they've signed treaties that say they won't. Now, you know, I suppose the cynics amongst us would say, oh, well, everyone lies. But what's scary is, what if they're not? What if they're telling the truth? Now, we don't know. I tend to think that this is bluster, but it is unprecedented. We've never seen leaders such as Erdogan, MBS, and the foreign minister of Iran, probably need to change that picture, but he was authorized by the leader, said, we want to leave the NPT if we don't get X, Y, or Z, or if another country gets them. In the case of Erdogan, he said, it's just not fair that there are countries that can't have them and countries that can. It's a principled argument he makes. He then calls out Israel and says they shouldn't have them. That's for sure. Next slide. Well, who's next? I mean, if one of those countries crosses into getting nuclear weapons, how might that have knock-on effects, other places in the world other than the Middle East? Well, it's hard to know. But meanwhile, certainly the Japanese are worried about the Chinese and are worried about the North Koreans. And arguably, they're not about to let South Korea go nuclear alone. I mean, there are certain cultural animosities produced over a historical period that won't let them do that. And of course, it works the opposite direction as well. This is combustible. This is a situation that could be tipped over by even something as remote as proliferation in places like the Middle East, as far as I can tell. By the way, once Japan or South Korea goes, you have to start asking questions about another country that had a nuclear weapons program once, Australia. And how these countries relate to us. Do they go their own way? Do they go Finland and feel like they have the protection of their own bomb and therefore don't need to be terribly concerned about having close military ties with the United States? Well, inquiring minds want to know, and if we're not lucky, we'll find out. Next slide. Okay, well, I mentioned China. That's another thing that's different. It isn't just Russia that's the main driver now of uncertainty about nuclear weapons. Let's take a look. Here are the traditional and respected projections of what China has and what it might get in the way of nuclear weapons. And you'll notice that the trend lines, whether you're the Federation of American Scientists or Stratcom, are upward. And that you're talking at least in the hundreds, debates about whether it's 200 or 400 or whether it'll be 600. I like to put the Russians on this chart, even though these are US estimates. There is a retired commander of the rocket forces, Yeltsin, and he came out with some estimates about a decade ago that he thought the Chinese had 800 to 900 weapons deployed already. This only suggests we may not know what they have. It does not suggest that they have the top number. It may well be the low number, but that's a lot of uncertainty for several hundred, to go from below 200 to almost 1,000 and not to know what's deployed. It could be the Essen number should be thrown out, but I don't know. I think they get a vote as well because we don't seem to know any more than them. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if it was just uncertainty about what they had, that might be tolerable if what they had was capped at several hundred. But what is greater in the way of uncertainty is what they might get. Now, I do not want to argue that because they can technically get, they will get more weapons. But they themselves, in their own official newspapers, or at least government papers, have commentators arguing that they should get 1,000 weapons, for example, to balance the United States. So the thought is out there in the public realm to begin with. So what could they get if they wanted to get more? How could they get them? Well, they have two online heavy water reactors that are ideal producers of weapons grade plutonium, and they're getting 2 more by mid 2025. These things, two can make about 650 kilograms of plutonium. That's roughly enough for 150. I would judge that if it's weapons grade, you should probably use the estimate of about 3 kilograms, roughly. Now, I didn't. I used a bigger number. So if anything, these are rather conservative numbers. I'm trying to, not go as far as one might. Next slide. Also, if they only took 1 or 2 of what are nearly 30 or so plants that are thermal reactors, light water reactors. They can even use ours, I suppose, if they wanted to be really nasty. These machines produce power, but if you took 1 or 2 off the cycle, instead of refueling them every, 18 months, you refueled them once every, 10 months, you could get, about 40 bombs worth of weapons grade plutonium per year. So, that's of interest as well. Next slide. Then they're building fast reactors, which, as in their normal operation, just produce weapons grade material in the what they call the blanket. And they have a small one that's worked, a little infrequently, but they're gearing up for one that is 600 megawatts electrical, and it should come online, they hope, mid or so decade. And it will produce a certain number of weapons worth per year. We'll get to those numbers shortly. Let's go to the next slide. Then you, of course, have to take the spent fuel and chemically strip out the plutonium, which is the valuable byproduct of fission that you can use in bombs. We have quite a little bit of activity going on. In 2021, they were supposed to open. Then the Japanese said, well, maybe 2022. I think it's now slipped to 2023. But they have a plant that can produce 1,600 bombs worth of plutonium per year, and that is conservative. And it's pretty much, there as a kind of loaded gun, if you will, for a fissile material race. The Chinese, meanwhile, have a 50 metric ton per year plant, which can produce a certain number of bombs worth of plutonium per year. The number here I have is, it should be, let's see, 2, 4, I think it's closer to, I think it's a lower number than that. That is that assumes advanced weapons design, which I'm sure they have 100, but I would perhaps make that lower. The planned plant that they have is a 200 metric ton plant, and it's under construction, and it would be able to produce roughly 400 bombs worth per year if it was used for that purpose. And they have an even larger one that they are trying to get the French to build, which may never get built, but it's even larger still. It's twice as big. The South Koreans are playing around with reprocessing technology that we are encouraging them to look at. It's not clear we're going to encourage them to actually build this, but they could. and that will enable them to separate fuel. And they have lots of interesting reactors to pull material from. So we have quite a combustible neighborhood from a nuclear standpoint, from reprocessing. Next slide. Well, you can see the numbers of bombs worth of material that could accumulate in Japan and China in a few short years. Essentially, what we're seeing here is numbers, that are easily in excess of anything the United States has deployed. You have, in the case of Japan, roughly, they currently have 10 tons, roughly, 9 to 10 tons on their soil of separated plutonium. You divide that, by 5 in the case of the material, and you get numbers that are, quite large, 2 to 3,000 bombs worth. And they intend to produce more of this stuff, even though there's no way to use it in civil reactors to get rid of it all. In fact, it'll mount up even more if they open up that Rakasha plant. Meanwhile, the Chinese are right on the way to getting about 10 tons of material, almost by 2030 at least, and that's a pretty big number. That you're talking about, almost, let's see, 10 tons divided by, if you want to be conservative, 5, you get quite a large number. You're talking about thousands of bombs worth. Let's go to the next slide. Now, some people say, well, but they can't reprocess all the material they'd want to do that in the declared commercial plants that we know about. The problem is that there are lots of ways in which the Chinese in the past have operated reactors in ways that we don't know what they were producing. They even built 3 reactors in a mountain. We only learned about their existence, after they decided to let us know. Now, luckily, those plants, we're told, were never operated, and I believe they weren't. But you could easily build additional chemical stripping capability in small, inexpensive ways. One such effort was done, at least on paper, where you could build a plant capable of making a bomb's worth a day in an area 60 feet by 130 feet by 30 feet, and you wouldn't be the wiser until it started to operate. The industry actually put out the details on how you could do this so that people would give up trying to control for reprocessing. That didn't quite work from a policy angle. But you see over to the left, the Israelis actually did build small reprocessing facilities underneath the Dimonov plant, and we inspected it and never knew that that facility was there. So, if the Chinese want to follow that example, we might not be the wiser until late in the game. Now, this is a little paranoid, but it's important to know the range of uncertainties and what you got to worry about. Next slide. Then there is this uranium enrichment capacity. In this picture to the right, there's a kind of a blue plant to the bottom, and it's plant 814, and it's a dual use plant. It's used for naval reactor fuel. It could indeed be used also to make bombs. Rakasha has a uranium enrichment facility that is, I think, way in excess of what Japan probably needs, but currently, because they only have about 9 or so reactors operating. And then, of course, there are the declared and known facilities that are civilian in China that are quite extensive. Let's go to the next slide. Well, if you take a conservative cut and you just say, well, what if they ran the 4 heavy water reactors that they're going to get or have? 2 out of some 40 light water reactors they have or are going to get, and one of the breeder reactors that they're going to complete. You end up with, by mid-decade, 4,000 kilograms plus. It's 47.5. Well, you divide that by, this is all weapons grade, you divide that by 3, you get over 1,000 weapons immediately. And if you go out to 2030, you end up with, more than 3,000 weapons worth. If you add the enrichment, you get, at a medium case of projection of what its capacity is, you get, I don't know, again, you might divide that by 12. So 12 into those numbers, it's like, 5,000 bombs and, I don't know, 3,000 bombs or 2,000 bombs. You add all those numbers up, that is an enormous uncertainty. It is not just a doubling from 300 to 600, which is what most people think the military intelligence are saying. Let's go to the next slide. Well, those are a lot of uncertainties to deal with. What would you do? I think the first thing, sort of at the low end of the spectrum of difficulty, would be start talking with Russia and China, not just about how many nuclear weapons they have, but whether they'd be willing to work with us at all. And they may not. I suspect they won't, but be worth testing them, to come up with a set of country neutral sanctions in advance for any state that might want to withdraw, and say, look, if you withdraw, here's what's going to happen to you. So maybe you might want to reconsider withdrawing in the first place. There is going to be a nuclear non-proliferation treaty review conference next year. I don't know that it'll make it on the agenda. I know it privately was on the agenda. It needs to be publicly on the agenda, I would think. Next slide. This also is kind of a low-hanging item. Make fissile production an arms control topic, again with Moscow and Beijing. And besides arguing about freezing or declaring warhead numbers, why don't we declare what the fissile holdings are? In our case, it's easy. We've already done it. They haven't. I think in addition, right now, South Korea is not funding its pyroprocessing, and Japan is delaying Rokasho. I now heard it's now 2023. Well, maybe we should ask China to suspend its reprocessing and fast reactor programs. And oh, by the way, we can offer to do so as well, because those things are not economic at all. I mean, they make nuclear power look like too cheap to meter in comparison. The regular nuclear power looks very cheap compared to fast reactors, probably about half as expensive. And I think we ought to take the idea that we're telling the Saudis and the UAE to do, which is don't reprocess or enrich, and suggest that everyone in the Middle East ought to buy off on that. Just a thought. Okay, next slide. Let's see here. The third thing, which I think is getting very poor attention, is the United States should stop pushing nuclear energy abroad, certainly in the name of national security, or even, to clean the air of carbon. These arguments are not quite right. They're not quite right for a number of reasons. First, when you build reactors in the Middle East, more often than not, they get shot at. And so you really do not want to build reactors in the Middle East unless you are willing to entertain someone bombing it. This has happened 13 times since the late 70s. This is not theory, this is practice. And the missile age is going to make targeting reactors even more likely. It's already been threatened explicitly in the Armenian Azeri conflict, most recent this year. The Houthis don't quite have the range with their large Scud-like missiles, but they have claimed they are aiming at the UAE's reactors. We know Dimona is a reactor that Hezbollah would like to hit. You get the picture. Moreover, there are real economic models that not only environmentalists, but more important, nuclear utilities and large electrical utilities use that repeatedly and clearly indicate that if you want to reduce carbon, the cheapest, quickest way tends to be about 11 other things first before you build a new power plant. And so if you're true to be worried about carbon emissions, I won't say that nuclear power plant construction would be the last thing it would do, but it sure wouldn't be the first. We do not talk about those models. They tend to be proprietary. Industry uses them. We need to make those more public and debate what things cost. That would also encourage us to probably have a debate about how various kinds of energy is subsidized, because all of them are, but in different ways. And nuclear, I have to tell you, is got quite a lot of interesting games going on in that regard that need to be added to the actual price. And we need to debate how it compares with other subsidized things and get their costs out. But finally, and much more important, the IEA needs to be more candid about what it can detect early and reliably enough to prevent from being turned into a bomb. And here they just say, well, if we inspect it, that's a safeguard. That's not quite right. By its own definitions, it's got to discover a possible diversion before it becomes a bomb. And in the case of enrichment, reprocessing, and a number of other scenarios, you can't do it. And you need to start being candid about that. We are not doing any of this in our public policy realms on the left or the right. Got to get more serious about this. Next. Here's probably where most of you are most interested. I think we need to determine also what non-nuclear investments we have to make our nuclear and conventional deterrence forces work. We're backing into this brief. I think we're beginning to do it pretty well in the space arena, but not well enough, if you ask me. But I think also we don't seem to talk enough about how to make long-range precise strike systems difficult to target, which ones to use against what. Certainly investments in submersibles are going to be more and more important, as are other unmanned systems. And I think the whole question of how you launch and how cheaply you launch and is going to be very important, not only for, space missions, but also simply for a lot of military missions. Finally, it really would be nice if we could get the cost of active defenses down per shot. And we need to really push on what's possible there technically. There are a number of things that are happening in the laser area and other cheap shots per round that need to be emphasized. As well as passive defenses, super hardening, and the rest. All of this doesn't tend to get dialed into the discussion. I think we need to do it. Is that, I believe, the last slide? It is. We're done. Questions? Let's see, I think you're muted. I think you're still muted.
No, now I'm okay. Okay.
Now you're okay. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Walk through one more time. What in addition to, you mentioned notifying countries who say they may get out of the NPT, don't do it because we're going to do the following.
Yes.
What are the kinds of things you think we ought to tell them we're going to do in order to preserve the integrity of the NPT?
I would at least do the minimal, and that would be a number of suggestions were made by the former deputy director for IA Safeguards, Pierre Goldschmidt, and I commissioned him to put his thoughts and revise them to the latest tuning, if you will, and it's on my web. But what he has argued and has convinced at various times over the last 15 years, some heads of state, the foreign ministries, to play with, but then they drop it, is that if a country withdraws, it should be immediately announced that this constitutes a threat to international security at the UN, which then allows for sanctions if the Security Council wants. I think in addition, you could say, if you intend to withdraw, you have to be in compliance. And if you're not, you can't withdraw and be free of the responsibilities of the NPT. This is what North Korea has done, and we kind of let them do it because we did not sanction them when they withdrew. We only sanctioned them after they exploded a device 3 years later. So that is a bad example. You do not want to repeat or encourage people to think that that's how they're going to get treated.
Yeah.
You know that, but again, there are a number of other things. You could say, well, if you withdraw, you have to cease all enrichment and reprocessing prior to withdrawing until we can assure that you haven't made a bomb.
Interesting.
There are a number of things. But instead of picking on countries like, we love picking on Iran, do it in a kind of country neutral fashion so that people get the message that this might apply to your friends as well as your adversaries.
Understood.
Yeah.
The second question I have is, you've spent a lot of time on China.
Yes.
Will you explain a little bit more that the material they're producing simply cannot be used in the nuclear power in energy plants that they are either now have or will be building, that are just simply far in excess of what you would need to produce nuclear energy?
Well, I think this is true with regard to plutonium that's being stockpiled for the simple reason that there is no place to put it. In the case of Japan, they literally don't have the reactors to burn it, nor do they have them yet in China. Now, some people are, well, you could fashion it and put it in regular conventional, light water reactors, but we don't see any signs of the Chinese building fuel fabrication plants for that purpose, and it's quite complicated. Nor have they even played with doing that. So it looks to me like they have to store up an awful lot of plutonium and argue, well, eventually we're going to use this in our breeder reactor, which is coming. And the other breeder plants that we're going to build maybe another 15 years from now. Stockpiling that material, though, is a very foolish thing to do. And here's why. I'm not a big fan of wasting money on uneconomic commercialization of designs that are fast reactors. I think it can wait until we really need to utilize every last possible nuclear reaction by using the plutonium. I mean, uranium, fresh uranium, is fine. It's cheap, and we have plenty of it. Until that is rare, I wouldn't bother with that. But if you're going to go down that route, you can, and you normally do, start those reactors with medium enriched uranium anyway. You do not need to stockpile plutonium. On the enrichment front, it's a matter of the Chinese, like the Russians, I think have overbuilt. They have more enrichment capacity than they have civil or even naval reactor demand to sop it up. And I think in the case of Japan, if they really build out what they plan to do in the next year or so, it's probably suspicious, or certainly not economic. It's thoroughly Japanese economics rather than market economics that would suggest that makes sense. So no, I think these things, we can afford to wait, and it will not impact the growth of nuclear power, actually. I mean, this is another thing. You know, people say, well, you got to let them do anything they want or they'll die. Well, no, you don't. You can grow nuclear power in all of these countries if that's what you want to do, without expanding enrichment capacity for the moment because we have a surfeit, or bothering with reprocessing.
Okay, my next question is related. You mentioned in your remarks you made earlier this year at our seminar series that we need better intelligence in terms of figuring out what folks are up to. One of the things you addressed is, what would it look like if Iran was, assuming they don't have a nuclear warhead now, but decided to do a workable prototype and build some nuclear warheads? And how is that related to the adequacy of our intelligence, as well as that of our allies, of finding out, determining what Iran is up to?
Well, I mean, the whole controversy about Iran is a controversy about what is safe and what is dangerous. You know, since the NPT was signed in it came into force in 72. The problem has been drawing that line. And initially people said, well, you don't have to draw the line because nobody has enrichment except the nuclear supplier states, and they have nuclear weapons for the most part. But even that began to change. And then they had to have a Band-Aid saying, well, don't let other people get enrichment. Then there was the concern about reprocessing, and we kind of got around that because countries said, well, maybe we won't reprocess, but we will enrich. And the difficulty that we've had with countries like Iran is they say, well, we're going to enrich. As soon as you get to enriching and reprocessing, you're dealing with large numbers of weapons worth of powder, liquid, and gas. Good luck keeping track of that. I think it's the Rubicon. I've become a little more radical. I think actually when you get a large nuclear power program, you have so many ways to procure and train people. You might be able to hide things as well beyond our ability to keep track. But once you get into actually reprocessing and enriching and fabricating the fuels of highly enriched or medium enriched uranium and separate plutonium, I think you got to say, well, we can monitor what's going on. We could say, well, maybe we could find out if they got a bomb at some point after they got it, but you probably are going to not know day to day what's going on.
Well, with that, Henry, I want to thank you on behalf of the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies and our Cyber Innovation Center and the Louisiana Tech Research Institute for you joining us today and speaking to us about these serious proliferation problems.